Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Dylan Rodriguez. I'm here as the co-director for the Center for Ideas and Society. I'm a professor in the Department of Black Study and also in the Department of Media and Cultural Studies. It's a privilege to welcome everybody here and watching this recording to an event we've titled Rethinking Retention, Rethinking Faculty Diversity, sponsored by the Dreaming Retention think tank as part of the Center for Ideas and Society's Faculty Commons project. I'd like to open this occasion by acknowledging Rupert and Jeanette Costo's legacy of reclaiming, protecting, and sustaining Indigenous presence at UC Riverside, including epistemological, archival, and physical forms of Indigenous thought and being. The University of California is a settler colonial institution that occupies unceded land and ecologies continuously inhabited by original and ongoing human caretakers, the Cahuilla, Tongva, Luiseño, Serrano, and other peoples. This colonial institution continues to be populated by Indigenous, Aboriginal, and First Nations peoples from all over the world, many of whom are among faculty, students, and staff. UC Riverside is blocks away from the site where the Riverside Police Department stole the life of 19-year-old Taisha Miller not long before I started working here. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department, with which the university has a cooperating police relationship, is regionally and nationally notorious for creating cruel and often fatal conditions in local jails for people who are awaiting trial and cannot afford bail. It is a shared responsibility to address how the University of California is actively complicit in long and ongoing histories of anti-Black state and state-condoned violence. It is thus with a sense of urgent obligation that I offer these words in place of the sanctioned so-called land acknowledgement. I'm honored to open this precious occasion by urging all of us to build on Rupert and Jeanette Costo's example by seeking new and old ways to create decolonized, abolitionist, and liberated futures. Welcome, everybody. As I continue, I want to offer some brief background on the origins of today's roundtable in the UC Riverside Faculty Commons Project. Professor Donatella Gullatt, our brilliant colleague from the Department of Theater, Film, and Digital Production, approached me a little over a year ago to collaborate on building what quickly became the project we are calling the Dreaming Retention think tank. The think tank is a group of a couple dozen UCR faculty colleagues from the College of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences who are committed to sharing and hiving our collective experiences, insights, and knowledge to develop practical strategies for inducing concrete institutional change. Part of this has involved today's collaboration and ongoing collaboration with Imagining America, a renowned research center based at UC Davis, directed by our colleague, Professor Erica Cole-Arenas. Participation in the Dreaming Retention think tank and its planned events is open to UCR faculty of all identities and backgrounds. Just reach out if you'd like to hook up with us. It is animated by colleagues who identify with historically underrepresented communities and demographies. We find that many of us share disproportionate, if not asymmetrical, experiences with harm and adversity as a result of various normalized institutional conditions. Some of this adversity and marginalization derives from many ways our scholarly and creative work does not conform to dominant disciplinary and aesthetic paradigms. Today's roundtable aims to contribute to ongoing rigorous evaluation, solution-oriented planning, and robust extramural collaboration toward the objective of constructively and immediately addressing these institutional conditions, especially as they negatively impact faculty retention. As we begin this roundtable discussion, a few notes and reminders. The event will be recorded for eventual posting to the Center for Ideas and Society YouTube channel. So while there are folks in attendance live today, please keep in mind that this is intended to be available to people in posterity, administrators, faculty, students, and others. Another reminder to please turn on your captioning function on Zoom if you desire. Note that the chat and Q&A functions will be open. Please feel free to make use of both throughout the meeting. And finally, we will allow attendees to come online to comment and ask questions at the designated time near the end of the roundtable. With that, please help me welcome our panelists for this vital discussion, whom I will introduce only very, very briefly for the sake of time. First, our 6 UC Riverside faculty members, all of whom are part of the Dreaming Retention think tank. Anthea Kraut, Professor and Chair of the Department of Dance. Voris Nunley, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Black Study and faculty in the Department of English. Annika Speer, Professor of Teaching in the Department of Theater, Film, and Digital Production. Cheryl Vint, Professor and Chair, Department of English, and faculty member in the Department of Media and Cultural Studies. Melissa Wilcox, Professor in the Holstein Family and Community Chair in the Department of Religious Studies. And finally, Victoria Reyes, Associate Professor in the Department of Gender and Sexuality Studies and affiliated faculty in the program in Southeast Asian Studies. Notably, Professor Reyes is the author of the recently published award-winning book, Academic Outsider, which is prominently cited in the Critical Intersections Report, which this panel will be discussing. It's a pleasure to also introduce our 4 administrative participants. Yvette Gullatt, Vice President for Graduate and Undergraduate Affairs, Vice Provost for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and Chief Diversity Officer for the University of California System. Offering his thoughts through a pre-recorded response, Douglas Haynes, Vice Provost for Academic Personnel and Programs for the University of California System. Mariam Lamb, Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at UC Riverside. And Daniel Jeske, Vice Provost of Academic Personnel at UC Riverside. We will begin with a 20 to 25-minute overview of key insights from the Imagining America Critical Intersections Report, led by our colleague Cal Alston, who is one of the co-PIs for this national project and one of the leaders, administrative leaders at Syracuse University. Immediately following, we will ask our panel of faculty and administrative respondents to offer concise 5-minute responses to the report, followed by an open discussion with attendees using whatever time we have remaining. Please help me welcome our colleague, Dr. Cal Alston.
Thank you, Dylan, so much, and to all of the folks at UC Riverside for inviting me to participate at this next phase of your critical endeavor. And I said this earlier when before we let everyone in, but I'm really here to kind of reflect back and serve the needs of this project, and to hopefully connect the goals that we had as doing our project with the things that you all want to do at Riverside. So I'm going to jump through a few slides just to give people who haven't had a chance to read the report, to give you a sense of what we started out to do and where we got to by the end of our 3-year research project. And then I'm going to veer off a little bit and try to connect some of the insights from that project to what I see in the application for UCOP funding and all of the things that have happened with the project at UCR. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen. So first thing I should say is critical intersections, public scholars creating culture, catalyzing change, was not the original name of our project. It was Leading Learning Initiative, the Leading Learning Initiative. And it is a project that was funded by the Mellon Foundation and to Imagining America. And Erica, who is as our the to work with my background.
Cal, you're going in and out a little bit. Maybe you could go off camera and maybe that'll help with the bandwidth.
Okay, I'll do that. Is that better?
I think so.
Okay. That I was a senior associate provost and senior VP at Syracuse University and director of women's studies at University of Illinois, where I was before I was at Syracuse. And so gonna start out, we changed the name because Leading Learning Initiative did not really seem to capture very much of what we were trying to say. And when we got to the end, Eric and I sat around in the office for a couple of hours and just sort of threw everything against the wall to see what stuck. And so we came to critical intersections, public scholars creating culture and catalyzing change. Okay, the research goals from the report were to produce and present original actionable research, to hold institutional education accountable, particularly to support public scholarship that engages the methodologies of arts, design, and humanities, which is part of our charge at Imagining America. Second, to connect and convene a national network of campus and associational leaders and graduate students, scholars committed to public scholarship to help us, and really a coalition of scholar leaders in this area. And then to produce interactive guides, resources, and media. So tools to come that are being built now, some of which are going to be available very shortly. We wanted to look at the areas of institutional life that marginalize public and engaged scholarship, and the ones particularly that are the most stubbornly resistant to change. And then what institutional change looks like in practice, and then some effective approaches to organizing institutional change. And that's why we started off with a group of 27 campus and associational leaders as our advisory group. And then we branched out for the second phase of the project to talk to scholars and artists who both are inside and outside of the university, but have some kind of a linkage to that space. So we did qualitative stakeholder interviews. We had about 100 total. We did 50 in our group. And then we had 2 groups of graduate students who were each doing 25 interviews, roughly 20. We also have case studies that are digital case studies that we solicited from our member institutions. And I just looked at them all again. We have, they're fantastic demonstration projects of how the relationship between community outside of the institution and communities inside of the institution work together to advance and create new knowledge. We had study groups over the 2 years of the project. We had 3 organizing institutes, and we developed a set of communication messages to different kinds of audiences that might be helpful. To go back a little bit to Dylan's original substitution for the land acknowledgement. I can't remember what you entitled it, Dylan, but it's not surprising to me to hear the way that he's created a larger message around that traditional, if you will, land acknowledgement statement, and really opened up the field of critical inquiry about who we are and where we are, what lands and spaces we are occupying as universities, because that's immediately what emerged from our conversations with those original group of interviews, that everybody wanted to talk about what institutional culture was. We were talking about institutional change. You can't change unless you have a little bit of a diagnosis. And it had to be both specific, but also quite broad in terms of what was meaningful to our participants. And we did have a whole set of historical contexts and spaces of things that I'm sure are familiar to all of us. Universities, these particularly big land-grant universities, but other large research spaces are spaces that have taken and extracted from the communities, the land around them. And also the norms and behaviors and roles that I would describe a university as a huge cargo ship or a huge ocean liner, very slow to change, very complex systems of human beings and machinery. And an unwillingness to change. And one of the things I just would say is that when we were doing this start, so obviously did a lot of our work during the pandemic. And one of the first things that people said in their interviews was, we were always told that universities can't change fast. And yet we all got that email in March of 2020 that said, we will be changing and pivoting and making a huge change in our the way that we deliver instruction. And so I think people were both in the midst of dealing with those conflicts and challenges, but also a little bit feeling like, if we can change for these purposes, couldn't we change for the broader purposes of justice and social advancement? And then one of the places I think that faculty is in that center space of power, how willing we are to address structural power, prestige, and administrative culture. Rankings are still very important to our institutions. And what that means is that there is sorting and ranking of the work that people do inside of our institutions. And then we have the values, and also then what we really found was that in this set, and then particularly as we moved to the second set of interviews with the scholars and artists in the community, was that it wasn't just these huge external forces, these huge external power structures, these huge bureaucracies. It was certainly that, but it was these sort of the way that those all redounded in the everyday life of institutional actors. And I think that's one of the ways in which I really see the connection between our project and your project about retention, because it's not just about keeping people penned up in a particular institution, but it's about making their everyday life meaningful and a site of success and contentment. And so I think this slide, I always just love to go back to, because it reminds me that we had just a ton of commonality in terms of how people perceive their roles, their place, their survival inside the institution, no matter what roles they occupy. And so we asked what's important when working towards institutional change, and we have policy, culture, procedure, all of those things. But we really wanted to start to talk about, again, these daily practices that everybody encounters in different ways, and how they either learn to live with them, learn to twist them, learn to utilize them on behalf of their communities, the projects, and the knowledge building that they found most important to their life in the institution. And then we really were looking at how to recast the idea of what scholarship and research can meaningfully be, and really looking for these big obstacles, but also ways through those obstacles, and to really get engaged in sharing values, highlighting those values that institutions claim to have, but do not always enact. So that was another space. One place where I found, again, that we had a lot of consensus among our faculty and administrative colleagues was the importance of graduate student experience, particularly as students are being invited to come into spaces in which they want to do engaged and activist work, and nevertheless they struggle to, in the same way that some faculty do, to find those safe spaces in the institution and the support, both material and personal, to make that work possible. And so this is from one of the grad student reports talking about the institutional barriers that they found in their inquiry. And they're exactly the same as what we found with the faculty scholars. Faculty departmental mentorship challenges, lack of valuation and legitimation for their work, financial security and financial support, and then additional intellectual and emotional labor, being told, for example, that it's all well and good for you to do this work, but you're going to have to do it on your own time. I can support you kind of from the back seat, but I don't really have any funds to give you because you're not falling into the categories of support that the institution sanctions or that I can get from an outside source. So these students, these doctoral students, are the future faculty. So we can't retain who we never are able to bring to the table. And these scholars are really telling us with their actions, with their passions, what it is that matters the most in their world and will matter the most in our world going forward. And then these are just some of the bullets from the other grad student report, again, with very clear means of connecting it to what faculty and external community partners told us we needed to be doing inside our institutions. They're very much the same kinds of things: institutionalized support for the creation of community research ethics, instructional and diverse methods, recognizing and support for the emotional toll and possible trauma that can accompany public and activist scholarship. Think about how teachers retention is something supported, but how community, both close in every day when you walk down the hallway, and what happens when you step outside of the so-called normative conditions for success in your institution. And then looking for ways to leverage respect for those internal scholars into respect for the community, communities are surrounding the university and surrounding that scholarship. So here's the 5 meaning-making statements that we came up with. There's individual and collective damage done and limits set by the enduring structure and cultures of higher education that do not understand, recognize, or support public scholarship. These structures and cultures are maintained through specific disciplinary, bureaucratic, and extra institutional practices. Yet public scholars, and I think for me, this was, in a way, the shock. I was expecting the stories of damage in a way, but I was not expecting the really creative and collective ways in which public scholars are finding ways to survive and thrive by creating spaces of peer support, learning, care, and wayfinding. And then I think this is one of the pieces that Erica really developed for us, which is the theories, methods, practices, and outcomes of public scholarship itself. So the ways we do our work lead the way in transforming the academy toward a place that recognizes and values a wider range of producers of knowledge. And so it's not by, I mean, we do have to build policies, but it's not just building policies. It's actually mobilizing the things that we know, the things that we research, the things that we write about that changes, that has the power to change institutions. And to confront the enduring problems, approaches that involve interruptions of business as usual are critical in these times. So I'm going to stop sharing. Dylan, how much time do I have?
I have you good to go another 5 minutes or so if you like.
Okay, great. So one thing I wanted to just talk about a little bit is that we did do an assessment of our project with our internally funded group called APPS, which is assessing public engagement scholarship. And key to that conversation and that inquiry on their part was really finding out how our goals as a team related to the values that Imagining America espouses. And so we spent a lot of time we have 7 value statements in Imagining America, and we went through and really talked about how each of those was reflected or not reflected, or reflected not as well by the goals that we set, the research that we did, and the way that we were beginning to talk about the outcomes. And then we really wanted to talk about what comes next. We have this set of interviews, we have a report. What do we do to actually enact the change? And after my almost 20 years involvement with Imagining America, I'm particularly pleased to be part of a project with the title Dreaming Retention Think Tank, because I think people think about dreaming or imagining as some kind of passive activity, but I see them as the catalyst for action. And so I think that Imagining America partnering with a project that has dreaming as the first word is particularly inspiring to me. Universities at this moment are called to enliven and support and buttress cultures of change, inside and outside of the boundaries, inside and outside of the self-examination of our histories and our present. And for me, this work is deeply epistemological. It's grounded in how we know and understand the relation between knowledge and knower, particularly how we acknowledge and recognize those knowledges and knowers who have been excluded from status in the system, which then leads to an axiological problem of value. We found in our research a set of conflicts between what the various stakeholders valued in the knowledge economy, that there's scare quotes around knowledge economy, the points to which, to whose intellectual goods will be recognized and rewarded. Finally, and maybe most directly connected to the work of the Faculty Commons Project, is how can we be in or of the university without being consumed or ceasing to be altogether. So I think I want to stop there. I was going to read a few quotes from our respondents, but I think I will cease talking and let the respondents here respond, and then if I can bring some of those back, I will.
Thank you, Cal. That was outstanding. Everybody, just a reminder, and for folks watching this recording, I've posted the link to the full report in the chat, and if you're watching this recording, then the link will be available in the text description of this event. I'm going to go into our faculty respondents, and first I have my longtime friend and colleague, Anthea.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. Thank you so much, Donatella and Dylan, for your leadership and for inviting me to speak on this panel. And thank you so much, Cal, for all of your work. I want to use my time today to center the performing arts in our discussion of public scholarship and to call attention to some of the obstacles to making performance happen at UCR. Obstacles that jeopardize our ability to retain faculty who, in my experience, are leading the way in producing knowledge that responds to urgent contemporary matters, helps us imagine radical new futures, and connects the university directly to global and local communities. I'm eager to highlight these obstacles because they fall into the category of what the Critical Intersections report describes as the structural and operational work of the institution, and are therefore less visible and arguably all the more insidious. As one of the interviewees quoted in the report remarks, "We're on the cover of every brochure, but we're denied space." This encapsulates so much of what we experience in dance. For example, we regularly receive requests like the one I got on January 27th of this year. Quote, "Hi, performing arts chairs. The CHAS Development Advancement Team has a Board of Trustees meeting on Thursday, May 4th, and they would like to provide a fun event that the board can attend after their meetings. Can you share with me if we have anything interesting happening, even if it's a rehearsal the trustees could peek into," end quote. We may help make UCR look fun, and UCR may profess to value the arts, but the way we do business all too often signals the opposite. Let me illustrate. This morning, we in dance welcomed the Primera Generación Dance Collective, or PGDC, to campus for a week-long artistic residency. PGDC is comprised of 4 first-generation Mexican-American dance artists who are all also first-generation college students, each of whom received both their BA and either their MFA or PhD from UCR. Their residency will culminate this Saturday in a series of classes and a public performance that will bring to campus students from Riverside City College and A.B. Miller High School in Fontana, who will perform alongside the company. The planning for this event began in September, and we selected week 6 of winter quarter because it's when dance regains use of the Performing Arts Lab, the only performance venue we at least nominally control, but which we split with the music department. On November 22nd, I received the following email, quote, "Colleagues, the exterior and roof of the Arts Performance Lab project will be starting next week. We will see a construction fence around the perimeter on Monday, November 28th. Work on the roof will start on December 1st. The duration of the entire project is expected to go to March 1st, end quote. Now, I became chair on July 1 of 2022, and this was the first time I heard about the construction. We were initially assured that though the fencing would remain for the duration, we would have access to the space by the time of the residency this week. This was admittedly not the best look for bringing first-gen artists and prospective students to campus, but we went ahead with our plans. Then just over 3 weeks ago, we were told that actually we will not have access to the lab at all until construction, now expected to last through March, is completed. This left us without a venue for the residency and also without one for our annual student production, UCR is Dancing. After some intense scrambling, we secured alternative off-campus venues for both productions. In my attempts to find out why we weren't notified much earlier about the construction, I have received no explanation other than something fell through the cracks this time. Although this example is particularly enraging, the failures of communication and the lack of coordination between units on campus are par for the course at UCR. The identification of cracks as the culprit also pinpoints my greatest concern about sharing this anecdote here. We'll all shake our heads and agree this shouldn't have happened, but because multiple administrative units are involved, no one will take responsibility. Each unit will point the finger somewhere else and nothing will change. This is my 20th year at UCR, and though I am by nature an optimist, I am losing confidence in the ability or willingness of administrators to take ownership of the bureaucracy and make it work for us instead of against us. There are many other obstacles that we throw in the way of performing artists. Did you know that you can only pay domestic guest artists via a paper check sent via snail mail? This seriously disadvantages artists and community collaborators who can't afford to wait weeks or months to get paid. And we are all hampered by a UC-wide policy that requires staff, who are often the only ones with the creative know-how to navigate the bureaucracy, to move units or campuses in order to receive better pay unless they receive a competing offer. So I'm at the end of my time. I'll just conclude by saying that we must have leaders at every level who will work to ensure that our bureaucracy and our operational procedures support rather than undermine the values we claim to hold. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthea. I'm going to move to Annika.
Okay, thank you. So I want to start by saying thank you to CIS, Dylan, Catherine, Cal, Donatella, Anthea, everyone who is doing this work. I know colleagues will address a myriad of issues from different angles. Anthea, you just touched on this with staff, but really I want to take a second and say that how staff are treated and affected, and the way that treatment of staff ripples out to affect the entire bureaucracy, how students, faculty, really the whole functionality of our workplace needs to be better addressed. Cal made wonderful points about what, and Anthea, about what and whose knowledge are valued, and the problems with how these incredibly narrow definitions work in our system. This comes up a lot in our department and theater and film, right? We do a lot of hand wringing and spend too much energy thinking about how to make our work and artistic practice legible to a statistician or a chemist or something in caps. And it's really hard to imagine the inverse of that being true, that they're sitting around wondering how a creative writing faculty member or a dance professor or a theater professor would be valuing their work. So I want to use my time quickly to talk a little bit about and flag up and advocate for the treatment of professors of teaching. There was a line in the report from an administrator saying that this work requires a keen understanding of power within the institution and making transparent how that institution works. And having recently gone through the retention process myself, I don't know if it's good or bad that I'm on this panel having just wrapped up my own retention, but anecdotally, I will say that that line really resonated with me because my experience is that the university has some serious problems with how they handle transparency. And the retention process is a pretty demoralizing one, including a lot of whiplash and backpedaling. So the only transparency that came in my experience was the camaraderie of fellow faculty and colleagues, people sharing with me and each other how they advocated for themselves, what they negotiated, what their salaries and retentions looked like. I feel a moral and ethical responsibility. I thank you to colleagues that did that, and I feel a responsibility to do the same. I'm grateful to have been retained, and I appreciate the support of my department, but I also want to add that the entire way that this process functioned is strongly stacked against professors of teaching. So I'd like to take a moment to address that. Because of how utterly narrow and hierarchical institutional definitions of what work is considered research and what work warrants valuing and retaining, the process just starts benchmark at a pretty adversarial and kind of weird place of ultimatum. So the first question you are asked is essentially, is the other institution an R1 of comparable or higher ranking? So the university is not actually interested in holding on to you as a faculty member because of the work you are doing, the students you are affecting, the mentoring you are doing, the teaching you are doing, the epistemologies and practices, or public-facing scholarship, or non-normative art. None of that is a primary consideration, but rather, is the university that's potentially going to poach you R1 or a higher ranking? That's the starting point. So as you can imagine, as a professor of teaching or for professors of teaching, we have colleagues who teach 800 plus students a year. And I want faculty who are not in this role and administrators to really think about that labor load, that teaching load, that mentorship load, right? There are faculty in their same departments, maybe teaching 2 grad seminars, a student size of 20 or something, right? So how might the current framework that we are operating under hinder professors of teaching? How does this widen the gap between what and whose labor and types of labor and work are considered of value? How does this systemically further entrench, making it so certain people's labor and work are valued and are worth supporting, funding, putting resources towards? They will be able to advocate for themselves, renegotiate their positions. There is going to be, I have been told by administrators like, oh, we're hiring more professors of teaching, like this is a great thing. But if you're not addressing these inequities, there's a lot of problems built into that. So I've been consistently told, I'm sort of if you know me, I'm a little bit the squeaky wheel about this, and I'm trying to do so respectfully, but I've been consistently told from administrators that these positions are equal, that the research track and the teaching track are equal ranking Senate positions. And respectfully, bylaw 55 exposes that that is not true. The treatment of, and Victoria, shout out to you and your book for talking about that. The treatment of teachers in general, of lecturers and adjunct professors, right, shows that this is not true. And that if you are in the professor of teaching position, how your labor is or isn't valued, and the structure and functionality of the retention process itself from sort of start to finish kind of exposes that that is not true. I reached out to Brian Sato, is a professor of teaching researcher at UC Irvine, and he conducted a survey on professors of teaching in 2021. So I reached out to him to sort of get a little bit of insight on what data he could share with me. And it is probably unsurprising information to you that more women are in this position. So statistically, I went to the UCR diversity statistics. So fewer women are faculty in general, right? I think it's 39% at UCR, 40% in the UC system, but more women are in this undervalued position. And also of note was that 26% of those surveyed were first gen. So I don't know what that stat is across faculty in general, but I'm guessing that that's higher in the professor of teaching. That's who's getting funneled into this position. So I see, Dylan, that I'm at time. I'm just going to make one more comment really quick, and then I will shut up. And then one more thing that I want to say outside of the professor of teaching thing is that I think another issue that we're sort of navigating is the problem with incrementalist gains. So Cal, you mentioned the need to disrupt business as usual to kind of make this headway. And when we sort of celebrate these little, we do a faculty climate survey, and the thing that comes out of it is, oh, now we have a COVID statement, or now it's 2023 and we value a book chapter, for a system that could be forward and progressive and cutting edge and forward thinking. This incrementalism seems wildly unimaginative to me and demoralizing. And I will end my time there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that generosity. And I really have to bite my tongue to not make editorial comments and input throughout this, because my gears are turning, my wheels are spinning, whatever metaphor you want to use. Thank you so much, Annika. Cheryl, you're up.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who's spoke already, and to Cal and your colleagues for the research, to Dylan and Catherine for organizing this. So I'm here speaking both from my perspective as a department chair who's trying to foster the careers of younger scholars in my department, which is English, but also as someone who served on CAP, our Committee on Academic Personnel, including a year that I was chair of that committee. And in both of these roles, I see that there's an urgent crisis regarding a misalignment between what UCR professes that it values and then what we reward through our incentive systems for faculty advancement. And in particular, I'm concerned that the university has failed to update its procedures for evaluating faculty to recognize the ways that the university and the university's place in larger civic society have dramatically changed over the 20 years that I've been a professor, not all of them at UCR, but within the professoriate overall. So I want to draw attention to 3 ways that I think the evaluation and promotion system fails to recognize the kind of work that is urgently needed today. And these all very much reflect the information that was on the culture is slide that you showed, Cal. So first is failure to acknowledge public-facing research. Second is failure to acknowledge contributions that enhance the research capacity of our campus, so building centers and programs, mentoring, those sorts of things. And third is a failure to recognize collaborative and field building activities as the innovative and transformative contributions to scholarship that they are. These problems mean that we often fail sufficiently to acknowledge work that's being done in emerging areas of inquiry. And these are often areas in which first gen and faculty of color are the leaders in the research, because our very presence in the institution is what is pushing research in these new directions. The reward structure, I would argue, promotes the kind of behavior that creates a culture in which retention is difficult. It rewards individualism, it rewards competition, and frankly, it rewards narcissism. This culture damages the university's ability to serve our communities, including our students, and it mitigates against retaining especially faculty of color, because structurally it puts the most barriers in the path of those who are seeking to do scholarship that works against these self-centered logics. So to offer a more concrete sense of what I mean by this, our evaluation systems often sees collaborative work as evidence that scholars have contributed only a fraction of effort to the scholarship. And I see how this model might work in some of the natural sciences where they have long established practices of co-authorship, which often mean that someone contributes something like a sample or data and is acknowledged as a co-author. But in the humanities, work that is collaboratively authored often takes more time and creativity to produce. And that's because we must work together, not only within the comfortable parameters of what we already know, but to understand phenomena from different disciplinary perspectives and methods, to reevaluate our own findings and methods in light of them and through dialogue with our collaborators. And yet, despite the fact that this work often opens up new lines of inquiry, and I'll note here that there's many scholars at Chaz in UCR who've been indispensable to creating new fields of study, including Dylan Rodriguez, who is on this call. Nonetheless, such work is often acknowledged only as a partial publication in our evaluation metrics. I also think it goes without saying that we all believe that the university should be a place of research excellence, but outdated modes of scholarly evaluation often have us see research excellence as a pole that is somehow distinct from collaborative and public-facing dissemination of our research findings. When we allow external metrics such as Google citation or H-index numbers or journal rankings to tell us what is excellent, rather than using our own capacity for expertise in our fields, we structurally prioritize what has long been established, frameworks that are perhaps even becoming passé, because these metrics work to prioritize older venues of publication as somehow more excellent. Within the humanities, this means downgrading venues that are the spaces of our most groundbreaking research, the scholarship that tells us where we need to go next, not where we have been. The more traditional venues tend to emphasize conversations within the academy, whereas what is needed is to communicate our research findings to the larger public, to prioritize what kind of research is most urgently needed in dialogue with the problems that are facing the world today and with the communities who are facing those problems alongside us. Scholars, and predominantly scholars of color, who do this difficult and vital work often find their contributions belittled as lacking sufficiently prominent placement. Finally, and perhaps most pejoratively, our pathways to advancement reward those who put their own careers ahead of everything else. Such people are often gifted with accelerated advances through the ranks, with more prestige, and sometimes with less obligation to contribute to our collective mission of teaching and service work and institution building. In contrast, the scholars, and again, frequently these are women and people of color, those who put their energies towards both their individual research and towards building the research cultures and capacities and infrastructures that benefit the UCR community as a whole, these scholars often proceed more slowly through the ranks because their contributions to this campus, are not valued as much as a publication record that a scholar might take to any campus. So incentive structures produce the behavior they incentivize. It's that simple. Currently, we incentivize selfishness over community, individual stars over collaborative research building, and well-worn scholarly conversations over rethinking what the university can, what it should be in the 21st century. As the report notes, one of the biggest obstacles to change is academic culture itself, and we must do better. Thank you.
Panels are on point today. I wish every panel was like this. Thank you so much, Cheryl. Melissa, you're up.
Sorry, it took me a minute to get to my video button. Can everyone hear me okay?
You're great.
All right. No, nobody's saying you're muted or we can't hear you, so I'm going to go ahead and go forward. I'm really honored to be here in this company and to be addressing these issues that have so profoundly impacted my own career and the careers of so many of my friends and my most valued colleagues from the very beginning of my career all the way through to this morning, yesterday. I want to focus on, with hat tip to Dylan for this language, which I really like. I want to focus on 10 among many of the everyday violences that send messages of a lack of belonging, a lack of importance, a lack of value. All of these are based on my own experiences or the experiences of my experiences of my colleagues over the years. After decades in the academy, I have to confess that I have little to no confidence in administrators' abilities to address these challenges, but I and the many others who are attempting to bridge the gaps are exhausted and demoralized, and many people are looking elsewhere, including outside the academy. I'll move through these quickly in the interest of time. Of course, I forgot to start my timer. Bad presenter, but I'm starting it now. So I won't give a lot of examples, but I think you can draw your own, because I'm sure a lot of this is going to be familiar to most of the people who are here. These are in no particular order. They're all equally important / egregious. Not responding to concerns, or not responding to concerns in timely and generative ways, or making clear that responding to the concerns is a burden, that the person is asking too much, that the person's being too demanding, too noisy, too much of a squeaky wheel. Thank goodness for all of our squeaky wheels, but they shouldn't be having to do that. Gaslighting and using one-size-fits-all equality measures rather than equity in order to disappear inequities in the system and in, again, the everyday experiences of people. Actively saying that people shouldn't have been hired, or that they are a bad fit, or that they were hired just because they were diverse or part of a diversity hire. Outspokenly bigoted senior faculty, no matter how much they are in the minority, having a platform to sound like they're in the majority. Gendered, raced, classed, sexed assumptions about how one should live, about things that one should be doing. This one I'll give a quick example of. I was actually told that in organizing our colloquium shortly after I got to UCR, that if I didn't understand how to provide the food, instead of using catering, which was too expensive for the department, that I should ask my woman colleague, my only woman colleague at the time. Pressures to live and work in ways that are suited only to certain privileged groups, the people for whom and by whom academia was originally created. I have these numbered, but not in order. Policies over people. Enforcing policy and not seeing the specific needs behind it. This is another piece of a kind of one-size-fits-all approach, when one size only fits the people for whom the academy was originally designed. Chairs having to send these messages, having to navigate between wanting to fully support someone and say your research is valued and the ways in which you do your work are valued, while also saying, and you're going to have to navigate through a system that realistically doesn't always value it. Having to be the one that sends the message, having to be the one that passes on the message that Anthea got about construction, that, hey, we don't actually have a space. It's going to take 6 months to pay you. I'm sorry, we can't reimburse for that. All of those messages, chairs, and that lands on the chair's shoulders, even as a chair who really wants to be supporting and inclusive. Underfunding and ignoring, many people have touched on this already, research and teaching from, again, people for whom the academy was not designed, carrying values and principles from their own lives, from their own communities, or treating such research as marginal or strange. I was told in my first tenure track position that I was originally hired on a 1-year because they were looking for somebody whose research was really different. And my research was, well, really different. I said, oh, queer, right. Not valuing who you might become. I've actually been told at UCR, we hired you for who you were. We're not interested in you taking time away from teaching to learn something new or to become something different. When the we in everyday conversation, policy, statements of value, mission statements, strategic planning, long-term planning is someone else, does not reflect who you are. And last piece, daily space and safety, space and safety for the bodies and minds of all faculty. And I'll stop there.
That was brilliant, right at 5 minutes, Melissa. You just have an intuition for this. Thank you. Next, I'd like to pass the mic to my longtime friend and colleague, Boris Nunley.
Thanks, Dylan. First of all, I feel very grateful and privileged to be taking part in this. This is what African-American slaves used to refer, the enslaved African-Americans used to refer to as hush harbors, where folks could say what they would not normally say publicly. And it takes courage, fortitude, and a certain amount of risk to do this. So thank all of you for doing what you're doing. The background for what I have to say deals with retention, which is a major problem here. One of the, many of you know, several years ago, a few years ago, prior to the pandemic, 4 or 5 highly ranked African-American scholars left Riverside, were not retained in Riverside and went elsewhere. And we're talking about folks who have won National Book Awards, who have been nominated for a MacArthur grant, right? So what's important to me here is the notion, particularly as the new chair of Black Study, is the notion that their lives are at stake. And it is not hyperbole. Long ago, Barbara Christians wondered, would Black feminism even be able to survive in the academy? Hortense Spillers, who folks quote incessantly, but very rarely quote the notion that she said, sticks and stones will break our bones, but their worth will most certainly kill us. So there's a lot at stake here in terms of what we're doing. And so what people are talking about here is lives, not just Black lives, where folks feel under duress, so much so that is often referred to by one of my colleagues and friends as a plantation, right? So the question becomes how does these folks, how do we lose them? And here I want to talk about the notion of fungibility, disposability, epistemology, and innocence. The fungible is a vital concept in Black study right now. The way that the fungible is defined is the ability of a good or asset to be interchanged with other goods or assets of the same type. So Black bodies become fungible and therefore are able to be interchanged as if there's difference, but there's difference without substantial significance. And what I mean by substantial significance is the word that all of them use at one time and another. I read it in your books, in Cheryl's book, I read it in Victoria's book, and other folks' book, the notion of epistemology, which we take for granted. But what we don't want to wrestle with is the notion that certain kind of bodies are not seen as producing or manufacturing knowledge. We're seen as producing difference, but not knowledge. So much so that at a Senate meeting, a professor got up and said, what you folks are doing is just boutique work. That's not real scholarship. So you have that reservoir that folks have to work against, have to struggle against, and it makes being on campus burdensome instead of liberatory, right? Black life being suppressed instead of Black life being supported. Thank goodness there are folks here on campus who voted for Black study. Folks are working hard, but right now we don't have a department, and there are reasons for that. But one of the problems is that when these kinds of changes occur, the argument of precarity gets deployed. There's always about precarity. And therefore, it makes establishing departments even more difficult. So because Black bodies are so fungible, what that also means is they're disposable, right? They can be gotten rid of, they can be treated as assets, they can be treated as commodities, they can be treated as neoliberal subjects whose only worthwhile, right, as neoliberal subjects is their ability in terms of entrepreneurship, which has been referred to, their ability to be entrepreneurs, right? So again, there is something at stake here. And it's dangerous because the university has talked about they want the recruitment, they want enrollment to come to blossom. Well, with programs like She, He, and Black Study, that makes it much more likely. But to the extent that we don't have those kind of programs, and to the extent that professors feel the way that they do, that undermines the university's ability to be relevant in the future. Black bodies, queer bodies, trans bodies, right? Black life gets reduced to a medium of exchange, right? The neoliberal ethos, not I think, therefore I am, but I consume, therefore I am, and therefore I'm Black, and all that matters is what I consume. And I want to shift from there. And what makes it difficult for us to change things, for institutions to change, for individuals to be otherwise, to do otherwise, to behave in a way that produces a Black futurity is what James Hillman calls American innocence. Whenever folks deal with these issues of race, sexual violence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the American ethos is to be, I'm innocent. No one is innocent. We all have to dig in the dirt in order to release ourselves from what's going on here. So institutions like UC Riverside, it has nothing to do with whether you're good people or bad people. It has to do with the fact that no one is innocent. So what can we do in order to change this kind of microaggressions? With my colleague Keith Harris will say there's no such thing as microaggressions. They're all aggressions, is what he would argue. And finally, and this is what's clear to Black, this is what is key to Black study, or actually another thing I want to say. Black study can only be said to exist if it remains connected to movement, if it remains connected to a community. This is how Robin Kelly defines it. So we do have to think about our citational practices. We do have to think about what counts as knowledge and who can make it. Because if we don't do that, Black study will wilt on the vine. And finally, and what's important psychologically, what's important spiritually, what's important practically, is the notion of unlearning. There's only two things, there's only one thing that Plato and Aristotle agree on. And that's the important, that Plato and Ice Cube agree on. Ice Cube and Plato agree on the notion of unlearning. And unlearning takes a willingness to go down to your own assumptions, dig in deep, and come up with something else so we can be otherwise. And if we want a diversity that's worth, an inclusion that's worth having, we have to recognize, as Bruno Latour talked about, all belonging contains conflict. And if we ignore the conflict, we'll never have the kind of Black studies program we want, the kind of inclusion we want, and the kind of belonging we want. And what I want to end by is arguing what Victoria Reyes is arguing for in her book, academic justice. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Boris. And finally, our last faculty respondent will be Victoria Reyes.
Thank you so much. And thanks to Cal Austin and co-authors Erica Cole-Arenas and Christina Preston for their great report, as well as Dylan, Catherine, and CIS for organizing this really wonderful event. Thanks also to my colleagues, many of whom I agree with everything that's been said, and I'll repeat most of it, perhaps in a slightly different way in thinking about it. I think from the report there, I wanted to highlight 3 things that really resonated with my own experiences and also in my reading of kind of the scholarship in this area. One is that the most enduring challenges of particularly faculty of color is within the everyday life of the university. It's not in particular moments, it's in the embodied experiences of everyday life, right? And that the problem is about what is valued and devalued, right? What is considered rigorous? What is considered important? What is considered to be worthy of time and not? And also this gap between university rhetoric about diversity, equity, and inclusion and the actual practices. I think that's particularly the case at some place like UCR, where we have so many wonderful colleagues, staff, students. We're a Hispanic serving institution, an Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander institution. And if we walked the walk of all of the rhetoric we have, it would be transformative if we actually valued people for what they bring. One thing that I wanted to kind of talk about in the report or pushback is this distinction between traditional scholarship and public scholarship. I think what's not named in the report is that racism is the reason. Racism is the problem of the academy, right? It's not about necessarily public scholarship, because we know that certain types of public scholarship are actually valued. Certain types of public scholarship, particularly, for example, public policy or working with government officials, are valued, right? That it's really thinking about the ways in which, as my colleagues say, is how our bodies, our knowledges of people of color are devalued. That anti-Black racism is the bedrock of the university, of racism and gendered racism against people of color. And so the solution is not individual, it's structural. And that we must, in order to actually transform, we must not put the burden on those who are most vulnerable to enact change, or those who suffer and bear the brunt of gendered racism to come up with solutions. And I think part of this, what we need to focus on is process, not just outcome. What I see in thinking about administration or in thinking about kind of DEI work, what is the outcome? The outcome is this many people hired. The outcome is this many people retained. What's not talked about is the qualitative experiences and the processes in which people are devalued, treated disrespectfully, in what is going on, right? So in my book, I talk about, and just came out in 2022, I'll do a plug for it, Academic Outsider, Stories of Exclusion and Hope, is really thinking about how faculty of color are conditional citizens, right? The problem is devaluation, precarity, and how faculty of color are told we are unworthy in our everyday work, whether it be research, teaching, or service. How is this? Some concrete examples in a few minutes. One is thinking about the COVID-19 impact statement. In many ways, this is just asking for more labor to quantify all of the hours, for example, I lost due to childcare, elder care, et cetera, taking away my limited time in order to quantify loss and not focus on my research. And yet the statement wasn't even sent to external reviewers. In fact, the default should be on the administration and the people in power to frame what's going on, right? Or it's about retention, or even when administrators at a faculty and promotion banquet don't know what department I'm in when they've only worked since I've been in a gender department, right? This is how the everyday life is embodied violence, right? Symbolic violence, embodied violence. And thinking about the shared governance. This is what happened in the climate survey, was a lack of faculty consultation. Faculty voice matters, and valuing it means listening and not just kind of consultation. So what is one concrete change? Perhaps actually having admin respond to suggestions by faculty committees with reasons why we do or do not implement the change. Our profession is based on revise and resubmit, enacting that in shared governance, right? Thinking about accountability of the departments and structures. In my former department, 5 assistants of color left in 2 years. And when you're asked to transfer, you're asked to put the reasons why a new department is a better fit than in why you are leaving. Right. And thinking about what are the structures at play, because it's not necessarily about individual actors. It's about the structures involved, whether it be bylaw 55 and the ways in which assistant professors or associate professors are asked to do labor that are not aligned with their rights. So change is difficult. I agree with my colleagues who says narcissism, selfishness, right? There's an inertia, people in power. But I think about Mariam, who says that hope is a discipline that must be practiced every day. Rebecca Solnit says hope without action is optimism, that we must think about this and practice. Otherwise, any change we know takes a long time, and it change commitment, and it's non-linear, right? There's progress. I don't like to use the word progress. There is movement forward and movement back, but we really must think about hope and transformation as a discipline that is practiced every single day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And apologies in the chat, everybody. I confused Victoria's multiple book recognitions. So I think I outlined and corrected that. So multiple book award winner, Victoria Reyes, thank you so much for your thoughts. Appreciate you. With that, let me transition our responses to start passing the mic over to our friends and colleagues from the UC President's Office and UC Riverside. I'm going to start with my longtime collaborator and friend, Yvette Gullatt.
Great. Thank you, Dylan. And thank you, Dylan and Catherine, for inviting me to join you today, and to Cal for your marvelous research. I think this is a really important conversation about how we go about transforming an institution that is producing exactly what its incentive structure intends for it to produce. So thank you, Cheryl, for that very succinct statement. I associate my remarks with 2 themes in the report. The first is the imperative for recognizing the value of community-based scholarship to the future of the institution. And second, the role of spaces and places within the larger academy that nurture a wider range of wisdom and knowledge, and that are sites of disruption that have great promise for transformation. To situate my remarks, I do want to share a little bit about my role, because the report rightly critiques the equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging infrastructures that are at the university in relation to the support and elevation of public scholarship. And I think there is a deeper analysis, and my colleague Mariam is here as well as Doug, and I think we ought to undertake this deeper analysis with respect to how these structures come to be, and also how they are intentionally constrained either through obfuscation, resource deprivation, and or disempowerment, or all of the above. So I have the pleasure of serving as the university's first system-wide vice provost for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a role I've held at the university in one way or another since 2015. And I have to be abundantly honest that when the president and the provost at the time asked me to take this role that was completely unformed and unfunded, I told them no. I was perfectly happy doing what I had been doing at the time, which is working on UC's engagement in public education and expanding our K-12 and community college student access to baccalaureate degrees. And if I'm completely honest, UC's track record to diversify the faculty was less than impressive, and it seemed a rather Herculean feat to try to accelerate diversifying the UC faculty when our efforts over the last 150 years had been somewhat stagnant. And it was also entirely clear to me why I was being voluntold for this role. I was the only Black person at the system office who was at best academy adjacent at a time of crisis. So I expressed concern about being accountable for solving a problem that frankly wasn't created by people like me. So I told them that if I had to do it, then we were going to aim for UC to lead the nation as an institution diverse, inclusive, and equitable, as a place to teach, to conduct research, to learn, to lead, to work for everyone. And we weren't just going to focus on the crisis of the moment for which they needed cover through a Black face. And so that means that for me and for all the work that we do here, every leader needs to be prepared to take the necessary actions that not only improve compositional diversity, but also to foster the kinds of campus climates that welcome support and, most importantly, cultivate the kind of public research and scholarship that's essential for changing campus culture to support public leadership. And to Boris's comments, conflict is incredibly uncomfortable in inclusion, and that's why inclusion stops when conflict emerges. So what I need them to do is to understand that transforming UC is everyone's job. It's the job of the regents, it's the job of the president, it's the job of the chancellors, and everyone on down. So my job is to keep them all honest and to live up to the responsibility of public institutions to make it possible for those who live here to thrive here and to lead here. And I will admit that it's much, much harder than I thought it would be. And I thought it would be hard. And for some of the reasons that the report articulates. But I would also say that in many other ways, we're at an inflection point given who leads our state and many of our campuses. And we have a once in a generation opportunity to push forward our advocacy and efforts that create the kinds of policies, practices, and procedures that you've talked about having a dearth of, but that promote racial equity and that equally important, actively resist and dismantle systemic racism and exclusion of the kind that your research explores. So the authors of the report, I think, make a good case for what it means and how best to center public scholarship in institutional transformation, while also recognizing the complexity of cultivating such an understanding within our campuses. To be clear, increasing racial representation at UC is insufficient and unproductive if it is not accompanied with a climate conducive to a full range of belonging, as the stories that you've shared here today and as the stories in the report illuminate, and one that values the multiplicity of perspectives and the broad range of talents that our communities represent. And there's one quote that particularly resonated. It said, audiences will be changing for universities, for every single cultural institution in this country right now. And so if you're interested in having a dialogue with that community and broadening your base, then you have to begin to put things in place that are going to make that difference. You don't wait until there's another upheaval to respond to. And so as a UC administrator with more than 30 years under my belt, my initial reaction to this statement was, well, that's what the university prides itself on, reacting to crisis. It's embedded in the history of higher education. I recently read a book by Eddie Cole at UCLA called The Campus Color Line, which is University Presidents and the Struggle for Black Freedom. And he talks about the strategic but often silent ways that presidents in the mid-20th century initiated and shaped racial policies and practices, both within institutions, but also outside of higher education in response to segregation, violence, and civil rights movements. But they often did that with malice and cruelty. And those practices still inform our academy today, as so many of you have pointed out. So you see urban renewal programs that displace Black communities near our campuses and speech practices that accommodate white supremacist speakers. These are all, and many, many more, still practices that are deeply embedded in our university. And as we become a more diverse state, right now, California has 55% of its high school students, or its K-12 students rather, identifying as Hispanic or Latinx. We have to persist in unveiling and putting into place the engagements and actions that will make a difference. But we are seeing some impacts of your efforts. The university, for example, is coming to understand and rely on community engaged scholarship to take specific and concrete steps. So community-based scholarship has placed really good pressure on our internal grant making, for example, so that it's more equitable and inclusive of the diversity of researchers, research methodologies, and communities. So our system-wide research policy grant office is now reviewing all of its grant making guidance, from everything from the criteria they use for reviewers and chairs to recognizing the burdens of historical exclusion to mitigate potential unintended consequences in their grant making practices. It's also helped advance efforts to repatriate Native remains at UC, despite the pressures from some research to retain those remains on our campuses. And in partial recognition for the harms of the university as a land-grant institution on Native sovereignty, the president, President Drake in this case, and collaborators from Native communities have announced the Native American Opportunity Program for students that waives tuition and fees for California residents of federal tribes. But why that specification? That's because racist policies enacted in the late 90s, like Proposition 209, preclude our using race in admissions, contracting, hiring, and financial aid. So we have a lot to do to undo these structures. But what these examples also make clear is that there isn't really a single office or a single role that's needed. It is a collective of activists, of researchers, of research offices, administrative offices, and both academic and administrative leaders, combined with, and I want to say this very slowly, a steady and unyielding public pressure that can lead to transformation. And finally, I'll say the president's priorities, which were announced in September, place a premium on expanding the knowledge base of social justice through research. And he set specific goals to create system-wide research grant opportunities for faculty that build research excellence centered on social justice and contribute to the eradication of racism, discrimination, and harassment. The second line of inquiry that I want to respond to is that spaces and places within the larger academy that nurture a wider range of wisdom and knowledge are really important to the university's future. I mentioned the demographic changes in K-12. Well, these demographic changes, both in our state and on our campuses, provide the university with an unparalleled opportunity to become the premier HSI research university system in the nation. And that will be a milestone in moving toward national leadership in racial justice and equity. So 5 of the UC undergraduate campuses, including UCR, are federally designated HSIs, and the remaining campuses are expected to follow soon, and Davis is very, very close to full designation. So a major part of our effort is to help the campuses establish what it means to be Hispanic serving research institutions within an increasingly diverse and global society, but using those approaches that cultivate and measure student success among all the different domains. So campuses that are fully HSI like UCR are collaborating with those that are emerging about how to expand research, service, teaching, and learning in the service of social equity, social mobility, and leadership, so that we are more than just Hispanic and minority enrolling, but we actually embody a culture of that service. And we envision that this full HSI designation and identity as a vehicle to fulfill our mission to provide transformative research to advance public service for the entire state and for all of its residents. So system-wide researchers, practitioners, community-based organizations, higher education advocates, and student leaders are working together to construct this kind of experimentation, the interventions, and the innovations for our campuses. And we've received nearly $20 million in federal dollars because of our status. And so we now have a system-wide HSI collaborative research center that brings together those researchers and practitioners and community organizations and higher ed advocates to come up with the fresh ideas and the best practices, as well as to leverage the political will to help campuses elevate the importance of scholarship beyond service or volunteer works. And it serves to support retention among UC faculty, and a research agenda is emerging that studies the roles of Hispanic serving research universities in cultivating the next generation of scholars, now that we have leading scholars trained at UC across the country. And then finally, let me say a few words about the power of disruption. We've seen growth at UC in the diversity of our students, our faculty, and our leadership. We've expanded the supports that are important to making sure that students are welcomed and achieve success. And we're examining and changing the policies, practices, and messages that impact equity, inclusion, and belonging. So there's lots of actions accompanied by some progress, which includes outcomes like graduation rates and recognition by national organizations. But at the same time, the university has just come off of the largest strike in the history of higher education, 48,000 graduate student instructors, TAs, academic researchers, and postdocs who went on strike for higher wages and benefits. With respect to equity, what the strike underscores is the importance of institutions doing deeply hard work. So as addressing what you might call a wicked problem, right? Of how you sustain equity and inclusion in universities at a systematic and structural level. And the strike illuminates that equity imperative. So our relative success in bringing in more first generation, low income, or underrepresented students, postdocs, and faculty to the university has in turn illuminated how a lack of investment over time has had a disparate impact on a student and faculty population that looks more like California than it did in previous generations. Our postmortem on the strike must also be an equity imperative consistent with your research and scholarship. We have to closely examine the historic and persistent structures and practices, including the resourcing for higher education that contributed to our current situation, so that we can better address the needs of those we want to welcome and include at our institution. So that concludes my remarks, and I really thank you for the opportunity to join you today.
Thank you so much, Yvette. Appreciate you very much. With apologies to folks, I'm going to ask our Center for Ideas Society Executive Director, Catherine Henshaw, shout out to Catherine Henshaw. Catherine will be putting up the video of UC Vice-Provost for Academic Personnel and Programs, Doug Haynes. He sent us a recorded video. We'll play about the first 5 minutes of it. And then we'll also post the link to the full video in chat for folks that want to see the full thing. After that, we'll hear from Mariam Lamb and Dan Jeske. So go ahead, Catherine.
Hello, my name is Douglas Haynes. I am a Vice Provost for Academic Personnel and Academic Programs at the Office of the President at the University of California. I'm also a professor of history at the University of California campus at Irvine. My responses to the three questions really provided me with an opportunity to reflect on the important work of critical intersections. There's a number of takeaways from the report that really stand out to me. I think one is how nested universities are within society. Too often, universities are imagined to be apart, to be separate, indeed to be ivory towers. I would argue that they're not. And I think the evidence presented by critical intersections demonstrates that they are profoundly connected in so many ways, but mainly through people and the communities that they inhabit. Most of you realize that universities are products of society. And it's for that reason that the process of change is so incremental. But the momentum is nonetheless important. American higher education has gone through phases of desegregation, integration, diversity, internationalization, and globalization. These very powerful impulses, movements, and trends have had a profound effect about who is a student, who gets to get educated, who's a scholar, who contributes to learning. What's so striking about the last 50 or so years is that the compositional diversity of our institutions are changing. They're looking a lot more like the communities that we serve. And it's precisely because of the presence of people from a broad cross-section of society that bring their experience, their learned knowledge, that the fundamental mission of the university is also shifting about what constitutes research or teaching or service. From my vantage point, this has produced a broad conversation, and I would argue commitment about inclusive excellence. At the heart of this idea of inclusive excellence is that universities and the communities that they serve should be about maximizing human potential. To this extent, inclusive excellence recognizes that human promise, talent, and achievement is broadly distributed in society. In other words, that it's not in one particular school or one particular community or one particular income group. But it's not enough to recognize the wide distribution of promise, talent, and achievement. It is imperative to understand and appreciate the historical barriers and intentionally seek to remove hurdles that distort and shape opportunities and possibilities to participate and thrive in higher education. Inclusive excellence then not only requires us to acknowledge the richness of talent in the world and our communities, it also requires us to come to terms with the contradictions of our society that our universities and colleges have participated in and contributed to, even though we now are seeking to transform these institutions into engines of mobility. Inclusive excellence demands that we embrace the imperative that all members of the campus and community served by the university expect equity, support diversity, practice inclusion, and honor free speech.
We can
And
pause
so-
there, Catherine. Thank you. Thanks again, Catherine. Appreciate you. Thank you, folks. We're going to put the link to the full response. I think there's about 7 or 8 minutes more in Doug Haynes' response. So we'll put that in the chat for anybody that wants to view it on their own time. Let me pass the microphone to longtime colleague Mariam Lamb, Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and Chief Diversity Officer. Mariam, go ahead.
Thanks, Dylan and Catherine and Donatella and Cal for coming with us today, being with us today. I took Dylan's charge of 3 questions very literally and seriously, and I won't take up too much time. But I think the most salient sentences for me in the report were: participants want institutions with power and resources to pay people for their work, expertise, and time. Many suggested that intentional efforts must be conducted to contain the more rigid disciplinary gatekeepers who are marginalizing others and maintaining the status quo from centers of power, and to remove those who have seriously abused their power by creating toxic environments. That has been the hardest and most unexpected part of this job since I've been in it for the last 7 years. And I want to linger on this notion of interruptions. I think Cheryl or Yvette called them disruptions. I think either and both will work. I think Cheryl at the beginning said that, or maybe it was Cal, said that, you know, institutions are like massive cruise ships that take a long time to move, but all of a sudden the pandemic comes and all of a sudden we were able to address accessibility issues, online racial, gender, xenophobic discrimination and Zoom bombing. When George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery were murdered in the summer of 22, all of a sudden departments were issuing statements in solidarity about anti-Blackness and such, and that led to many debates within departments and tensions within the faculty and grad students in departments. Our office of, I think it was 3 at the time, were slammed coming in to help facilitate meetings and department meetings, tense department meetings. And at the same time, that summer unearthed a lot of entrenched racial, gender, sexism, battle wounds that had been in these departments for decades sometimes, that had been left untreated, and these incidents triggered really the opening of these bandages again. And so these kinds of climate issues and tensions, you know, these interruptions forced these difficult conversations that people were sort of brushing under the rug, or the incidents that were not handled administratively well historically, or there wasn't a lack of accountability around them, had a sort of, you know, for better or worse, an additional layer of trauma and processing and attempted accountability, right? The labor actions from the grad students and postdocs was another interruption of sorts, right? That led to more institutions paying, institutions with power paying the resources to pay people for their work, expertise, and time, right? And so Dylan's second question about, and it's the right thing to do, we're gonna have a hard time affording everything, but as our other 14 labor unions in the UC system, their contracts come up, it's going to be ongoing negotiations that presumably will benefit the whole over time, right? one of Dylan's questions was what concrete actions the UC and UCR administration can undertake to address these matters, and which administrative offices should take the responsibility for such actions. So Dan's office and myself have to partner often on faculty diversity and retention issues, salary inequities, all kinds of attempted targeting of interventions within departments as people move through the ranks or don't. And I have to tell you, at every turn, even when you have top-down administrative partnership and consent, and they're all on board, we hit roadblocks in the departments at every time. And you'll recall that the Campus Climate Task Force report a few years ago showed that a lot of the frustration on campus was with department chairs, associate divisional deans, folks at the sort of middle management level not being accountable for addressing climate issues in the departments, right? And so Dan, myself, HR, the compliance office have been trying to target departmental climate issues, because that is where often the gatekeepers have their own hush harbors forth and create toxic environments, right? And so we've been trying to target, we have a mandatory series of 4 workshops for department chairs and associate divisional deans, now targeting everything from conflict resolution to appropriate investigative offices and processes. We're partnering with grad division on improving graduate advisor and mentorship training for faculty on grad student mentorship, but also faculty on faculty mentorship and collegiality. And then we're asking deans to more frequently than every 3 years really target performance evals of department chairs, and grad division to target performance of faculty grad advisors, and rather than every 3 years, to do it annually. And should they not be coachable, to change them out and turn them over more quickly. And so as you can see, all of these initiatives still require, just like faculty search committees, and that is still in the hands of the faculty inside the departments and interdisciplinary search committees. We still rely on the work of the whole. So what Yvette was saying about everybody having to do their part, we're really incumbent upon all of us to do that work together. So I'll pass it to Dan.
Thank you so much, Mariam. And finally, closing out our roundtable of 10 panelists, I'm going to ask Dan Jeske, our Vice-Provost Academic Personnel, to close us out, after which we will open it up to the floor for all of y'all that are here participating and attending. So please feel free to prepare your questions in your minds, to put it down in the Q&A function, put it in chat. If you like, you can be ready to raise your Zoom hand and come on to the floor live to ask your questions and make your comments. So just be ready for that after Dan speaks. Thank you. Go ahead, Dan.
Thanks a lot, Dylan. And I want to thank the CIS for the invitation to participate, be able to listen and converse with our distinguished guest and my distinguished colleagues. It's really been a gift to me to listen to a lot of what's been said here. And, you know, I don't consider that I'm in a senior level administrative position. I am in an administrative position. I feel like I'm a good person to advocate on behalf of what I hear from faculty, and I've tried to do that. And this kind of forum just gives me more material to work with. So I really appreciate being able to hear you. I was also kind of reviewing the questions Dylan sent, and 2 points I guess I picked out of the report was the takeaway that the Academy is not supportive of partnering with communities in scholarly endeavors and work on public imperatives. I learned a lot by reading the report and understanding this to be the case. And of course, I agree that we need to recognize the evolving forms of scholarship and not wedge our faculty into traditional norms only. I am on board with that. There have been things we've tried to do in the last couple of years with the call. And I heard the comment that maybe it's incremental and maybe we need more drastic change. But on the other hand, you know, we try to do what we can do as the opportunity presents. And some of the things Mariam said about roadblocks in the departments do get in our way. Even best intentions from administrators get, you know, there's resistance for ideas that most of the campus would probably like, but this is a shared governance culture that we live in. And bylaw 55 is a good example for the Professor of Teaching series. Getting those bylaws changed to give voting rights is something that only the faculty and departments can do, no matter how much administrators want that. We can't impose it. Secondly, I would say the report prompted me to think about how traditional disciplinary norms for scholarship is protected by existing structures. And those structures are under the purview of gatekeepers that are often people who are white. That I've come back to this idea as I've thought about the report multiple times, and I recognize it to be true, and that we need to establish, I think, leadership paths for those who would look for and seize the opportunity to bring change agents, if you will. We need to create paths for change agents on this campus. And certainly we must ensure that our upper administration, like the deans and the provosts and chancellors, they need to resonate with this report too. Otherwise, our hill is just that much steeper to climb. And I feel like I'll just offer my opinion that I don't see our upper administration leadership thinking anything other than the fact that this work was important and that this report is something for us to be thinking about as we try to move the campus in a direction that recognizes this kind of public engagement and scholarship. I thought about a few of the things that maybe are concrete that we can add to that we've started. And one is the use of department research statements that we started in academic year 21-22. And initially, those department research statements that come up with every file were to try and help outside reviewers understand things like the significance of authorship order, the prestige of different types of scholarship, what is a norm within the discipline for collaborations. But I think we could, and they have been useful for that purpose, but I think we can do more with them, including having a more thoughtful discourse in there about public scholarship and the role that plays in the evaluation of a file. And this is where I think dialogue in the departments is going to be crucial, because those department research statements are written by the department. And we need to have the departments, the faculty and the departments talking about this so that it can make its way in to the review criteria. This isn't something, I don't think, that the administration can just declare you must do this. Again, in a shared governance culture that we live in, that wouldn't work. But what for sure, we can have the conversation on the campus, we can coordinate that, and I will do that. We've tried to have a lot of conversation with department chairs in terms of what they might be able to do in their departments, but I think we need to support them a bit better. A lot of them are facing resistance from the faculty. This is something Mariam mentioned. It is true that even the Professor of Teaching series that Annika mentioned, yes, it's true that there are faculty and departments that don't get it and think that it's not a research position even. That's embarrassing. And I don't like it. I know that our provost doesn't like it. We need help from the faculty to change it. And this change management is always a difficult thing. So we have to figure out a way to improve the tools that our chairs have to take care of those kinds of pockets. And it was mentioned by one of the speakers that senior faculty in the minority can have platforms that make it sound like they're in the majority. That struck me as so true also. And somehow we need to take away the influence that they exert inappropriately, at least. We are kicking off the UCR Coro as a leadership collaborative designed to maybe begin people on a path to becoming change agents. And the more we have people like that in the departments, the easier it's going to be for chairs to get that consensus with new ideas and maybe not have things held up. And then, I'm always interested in working on the call, and we've made some strides in the past couple of years. And yes, I agree that maybe they're incremental and things about how grants and progress on book projects can contribute to a merit file. But again, this is something that it really is a negotiation between the faculty and the administration, because there are things like achievement relative to opportunity that yet a lot of dissent on our own campus. I had conversations in the departments about, do you think we can try this? Can we go to achievement relative to opportunity? And, there was a resounding no. Well, we can't lower the standards. We can't ask people to divulge all the reasons why their opportunity maybe was impaired. So it's not like I could just decide that we're going to do achievement relative to opportunity. Well, we try to do some things that come close to that with like holistic review, that we are adding in with life event outcome. So it's just a constant negotiation to try and get things done. Maybe it is baby steps one at a time, but I feel like it's better than just, acquiescing to the status quo and not doing anything. I wanted to mention that the Office of Strategic Initiative is pursuing this Carnegie classification for community engagement. This is Beth Klassen Thrush's project at the moment. That's going to at least get the conversation on our campus started about what this community engagement brings to the visibility and work of UCR, and how it might even attract people to come and address some of the retention initiatives, to know that we care about this and we look for opportunities to get involved with it a bit more than we have. Finally, I wanted to address the business interruption. I don't know, it seems to me like our scholarly work is evaluated through a peer review context. And to me, I think what really needs to be done is find ways to bring along those people who don't understand the change that we're trying to enact. And that might take some time, I understand it, but I just feel like it would be constructive to work on bringing in new change leaders and trying to change the hearts and minds of the resistance that is there. And for sure, it needs to be addressed. And there are ways to do that, at least to try to do that I think we can bring into our chair leadership series that my office and Mariam's office together run. Maybe we can try to help figure that out. And then, I did want to say a few things too about some of the other speakers' remarks, if I have a minute. The communication with the dance construction, I'm so sorry about that. I don't understand it either. Communication is not hard to have given some advance notice and to try to work around programmatic ambitions. I will bring this up and try to help understand why it happened. Retention process transparency, that's something also that I understand it. I've heard from a lot of people about the problems with the status quo process that we have there, and we're working on it. We have something under Senate review, some of you know, that's being reviewed to try to make it a lot more transparent and specifically addressing some of the concerns that I heard from individuals. And the critique that Cheryl offered of merit promotion process, I concur. It is about individualism. It is about narcissism. I'm trying my best to make that different, at least when it starts with the VPAP and the provost and the chancellor. But again, it's this tug of war that we have with faculty that are entrenched in the way it was when I came up, right? So why shouldn't it still be that way for everybody today? We try, and that's why progress, I think, is incremental, because we take the little gains we can get. I don't know how to radically change it overnight. And of course, some of this is embedded in the system as well. It's not just our own campus, but it's the UC system, the APMs, right? But yes, I heard a lot in there that I agree with. Finally, the climate survey, yes, we are doing it again, as you all know, I think. And I felt like the last time it did lead to some change, and I hope it will again this time. I have a hunch that maybe what I heard here today will turn up in the faculty climate survey. I hope it does, so that we can try again to do some things that maybe were missed on the first round of that faculty climate survey. So I just want to acknowledge that that's a good means, I think, to get some attention to some of the problems that you've all discussed. Thank you very much. I really felt privileged to hear you all.
Thank you, Dan. And with that, you all, I know we have 10 minutes left. This has been a really full and I think dense set of responses. I know that our colleagues Wesley Leonard and Dana Simmons reached out to me on chat privately to ask if they could raise a couple questions. So I'd like to maybe start with maybe I'll ask both of you to raise your points, and then again with apologies to everybody here for the fact that we only have 2 hours that we've allotted. I'll have the two of you raise the points and questions that you had, and then we'll ask for responses from the panel. And I think that'll likely close us out. So otherwise, I just encourage folks to put other questions and comments in the chat and Q&A like I just did, and we will make sure that stuff is preserved for posterity in the text part of this video. So let me start with Wesley and then go to Dana if that works.
First, let me give thanks to everybody who's spoken. You've all made me sort of feel proud to be at UCR. I know that they're like-minded people. Well, I have a whole bunch of comments. I'll try to be quick. There have been two ideas that have been operationalized throughout today's session that I think warrant more attention. One is the notion of public scholars and public scholarship. I recognize that we're drawing on a particular report that operationalizes that idea. People identify as public, activist, or engaged scholars from university and community-based settings, often working at the boundaries of disciplines. And I admit that I use the term in that way as well. But I think we need to consider, well, what would a non-public scholar be, particularly at a public institution? When we work at a public university, we all need to be public scholars. By extension, we all need to be accountable to multiple publics, such as UC students and the broader communities in which our campuses are located. And I think this must be central in all policies, but I'm going to note that it's not, as we've talked about today, particularly for personnel actions. I suggest a different type of framing, which would be accountable scholars and accountable scholarship. Of course, includes accountability to disciplines, research ethics, and so on, things that are already pretty well embedded, but also accountability to multiple additional publics and to knowledge itself. It further calls attention, among other areas, to the issue of positionality and how this is intertwined with research, teaching, service, supporting, and learning, and to the related ideas that accountable scholars need to spend time and effort, sometimes great emotional energy, engaging these issues. And finally, to say that notion of accountability applies over the long term. And this brings me to another point, which is that we're talking about dreaming retention. It's been my observation that retention is very often framed around something very specific, an action that occurs when somebody has an outside offer, and that might take place over a few weeks. I consider retention as something that starts at least at the time of hire, if not before, and that continues throughout somebody's career, if not beyond. For those of us who have relational worldviews, such as myself, who see ourselves as members of groups, we pay a lot of attention to what happens to the group as a whole. And yet, faculty retention actions generally revolve around individuals, and I see this as highly insufficient. Particularly when those faculty members, whether they remain or leave, point out problems at UCR, such as examples we've heard about today, who is ultimately accountable to addressing those problems? I suggest that administration, which does the ultimate hiring and firing and retention, needs to be much more accountable. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Wesley. Dana, why don't you go ahead and raise your point?
Thank you. I'm so inspired by all of you. And I'd like to actually thinking with Boris's comment that lives are at stake in this discussion. And I think that's a way to point us to think beyond quantitative indicators of how many people are retained, how many people leave, salary equity scales. Those are all critically important, and I'm grateful to people who are pushing with those. But I think the fundamental question is who can retain life in the academy and whose life is not sustained, whose sense of possibilities are limited by their own imagination, and whose possibilities are limited by the imaginations of others. And just to draw on the dreaming frame of our think tank, to think that some of these structural barriers to survival are not as necessary or permanent as they might seem. Bylaw 55 is an invention of the academic senate. It can go away. And I think there needs to be a sense of crisis and conflict that will allow for this opening of people to imagine their futures in the academy. And I'm so grateful to be present with all of you who are thinking with this and fighting for this in this space. Thanks.
Thank you, Dana. And let me just read a question by our Professor Emeritus of History, Carlos Cortez, from the chat, asking for comment on the national and local controversies over faculty diversity statements in recruitment and retention, which is, you know, a longer discussion. I would just add to that part of that discussion has really struck me as turning into a kind of semi-domesticated version, academic version of replacement theory among many senior white colleagues, in which there's this creeping anxiety around the Black and brown hordes, the queer hordes, replacing them by way of these insidious diversity statements. So I don't think that replacement theory is limited to the far right wing political reactions. So I know we just have a few minutes, y'all. So if I could just ask any responses from our 10 panelists, if y'all don't mind, just raise your hand so we can just take a few comments before we close it out at 5 o'clock. I'm going to be considerate of everyone's time, and we'll go from there. This is going to be an ongoing discussion into the future, I hope. Go ahead, Boris.
Thanks. I want to return for a minute to this notion of conflict, and I'm glad that it was brought up again. Yvette, you said that people get into conflict because they feel discomforted, and that's exactly my point. That there is no change without discomfort. Discomfort is the price of a meaningful life, and so if we don't talk about, and it also allows us to have more emotional agility. So one of the reasons why we can't have a kind of inclusion that is substantial is that folks are so sensitive. And when you have certain kind of bodies, like a dark-skinned body like mine, conflict means that I'm going crazy. It doesn't mean that it's time for growth. That's why I think it's important to bring this up, this notion of that, again, discomfort is the key to a meaningful life. And James Brown, Susan David, a psychologist, talks about this. James Baldwin talks about it, and that's why I brought it up.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I spend a lot of time with leaders, and I watch how they respond to conflict. So, the first thing is that they're going to try to placate everyone, right? They're going to give you something, but the minute you push past it, they're going to shut down, and all of a sudden the guardrails and the gates are going to go up. And that's what I mean by they can't really understand how conflict leads to growth because they don't experience it or value it. And that's why when there is pressure placed on the institution, they know how to respond to crises. That's what they're good at. So when you see the graduate students go on strike, and you see these kinds of things that put visible pressure on where the university is falling, you see action. I mean, I look at the outcome of that strike and I say, well, was there anything the university got, or did they give everything? I don't know what negotiating point the university won on in that whatsoever. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I think that's actually a good thing. But I think that there's a playbook here that we have to understand and develop that includes that public visible pressure that is a form of conflict, but that can actually lead to some form of change. But it is what they are really uncomfortable with. They are uncomfortable when we sit in meetings and we talk and we have those moments and they just shut down and set up gates. So as our leadership changes, I think we get people more comfortable with that kind of thing, more versed in that, but it is a terrible, it's a weakness in our leadership that we have that kind of not productive engagement with tension.
There's so much more to be said. Victoria, I want to give you the last word, almost the last word, then I'll close this out. I guess I'll get the last word, so I'll close this out. Victoria, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks. So thanks so much for everyone, both the panelists and the commenters. Afterwards, I just wanted to make a point that I think we can't put the problem of UCR and equity and inclusion on departments as though we can't hold faculty accountable, right? I think often tenured faculty can say academic freedom, but academic freedom doesn't allow people to discriminate, to be racist, sexist, and have all of these systems. And so I think that that administrators and people have responsibility to departments, because departments we can't see. So we can't see academic freedom as a way and a go around to let racism continue. Thank you.
And you all, I want to be considerate of everybody's time. I hope that folks will consider this conversation today as a point of departure and not something that is remotely definitive or foreclosed. There is no closure today. So I'm just going to encourage y'all to keep coming back to these points, these conversations, keep raising more. I'm going to close this out, actually, I think appropriately by reading an anonymous question from one of our attendees who wishes to keep in confidence. I'll close out with this question because it's relevant to me and to many of us here. How do you explain the upper administration's utter lack of acknowledgement of the overwhelming positive Senate vote, 89%, for the Department of Black Study at UC Riverside? How should we not take this as evidence that we unapologetic Black people and Black epistemologies are just not wanted and respected? Yes. On the point of no closure, I'm going to actually close it there. I'm going to end there in the hopes that we will continue discussing, debating, and maybe intensifying all of that in the near future. And my deepest thanks to the 10 of you who agreed to be part of this roundtable, this panel. The sense of risk and vulnerability and courage that it took to participate, I don't take it for granted at all. I really appreciate all of you, and maybe I'll stay in the UC system a little bit longer because of you. All right, appreciate all of you. All right, good night, everybody.